No arguing that it was British here in British Columbia in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That's probably the reason why Great Britain sent us so many of their second sons. They were stereotyped as being wastrels and layabouts and do-nothings, but without them, how long would it have taken us to become introduced to the sports and cultural activities that we cherish so much today? These were the Remittance Men, and on this edition of Pioneers in Places, Dorothy Zollner and Elise Lundy tell us some of their stories. Welcome to Pioneers in Places. Mike Roberts with my first of two storytellers, Elise Lundy. Elise and I have talked before about historical things. In a little while we're going to meet Dorothy Zollner, who together with Elise do all sorts of historical stuff. But for the purposes of this conversation, Elise has been the president of the Okanagan Historical Society Executive Council and a fan of history everywhere. We're talking about, I don't know, scoundrels, rogues, dreamers is the way they've been described, remittance men in British Columbia.
Right.
When are we talking about here? And who were these guys in what era?
Well, we're talking about late 1880s to about 1914, around 34 years.
34 years.
34 years. And these men were in the 1880s. Their parents couldn't buy them a commission in the British forces, and so they of course had to be the second sons. The first sons would get the land or the factories or whatever the business was, and the second sons either went into the clergy or law or worked for a wage. And these second sons, because they were in the elite or the higher up in the...
they came from wealth.
They came from wealth, the aristocracy. So they had a choice. If they didn't want to do that, they could go and be sent to the colonies and receive a remittance once a month from home.
To stay away.
To stay away, to keep out of trouble, because that's what they were getting into. All they did was play and a few other things, and rather than have them as an embarrassment to the family, they sent them to the colonies hoping they could make good out there.
So the colonies would be India or Australia
or Canada.
Yeah.
And sometimes the parents would take and pay a farmer in Ontario either $100 or $500 to train these young men. And a lot of them were around, say, 18 to 24, not very much older than that. And they were called mud pups because they would supposedly learn how to farm.
Why did you bring the cowboy hat and the spurs? What's this about?
Well, most of them, particularly when they arrived into Alberta, they thought they would be cowboys on a ranch.
On a ranch.
On a ranch. If you read it, it's spelt a little differently than a ranch. But their hat, their cowboy hat, would be 2 inches wider than this on each side, like a full 4-inch circle on this. And they would have spurs that were much bigger, rowels. They'd have a 3-inch rowel.
They were really...
But you see, that made a lot of noise when they walked along. And they would have they'd have the chaps with fur, and they would go into a store, and of course the storekeeper knew that this fellow was just out from England or Britain, and he wanted to dress like a cowboy. And so they would dress them in these outlandish outfits. And of course, anybody that saw them coming along, they'd have their carpet bag and a huge trunk behind them, because they'd already got a list from the Church brothers who settled near Millardville in southern, south of Calgary. And this was what they were supposed to bring.
Now, there was one guy, wasn't there? I mean, he took the hazing and everything, and it worked. Who was that guy?
Yes, Newbolt. And he came out, his father actually had bought him a share in a ranch or a company who had land around Calgary. And this gentleman met up with the herd that was coming up from Montana. And he was, because he had the money to pay for the herd and pay the cowboys off, because he'd been given that debenture to do that, he rode up, and of course he's got his bowler hat on and his suit, you know, with his vest and his puttees and whatnot. And of course the cowboys looked at this, rode past him, shot holes in his bowler hat. You know, I mean, this is very scary, but Newbolt stayed with it. They gave him the night watch, and night watch is usually 4 hours. They left him out there all night. The next morning, they were to take the herd up into Calgary, and they gave him a green horse. None of the other fellows seemed to be able to ride it.
A horse that was unbroken.
That's right. He got on the horse, went through the bucking stage, rode it out into the prairie until it settled down, and came back. The cowboys accepted him, took him into town, and dressed him the way that they dressed, not like the Remittance Men who walked along the Calgary streets with their big rowels.
Now, some of them decided to promote communities.
Yes.
And that's what Dorothy's going to talk to us about.
Yes, one community that was promoted was Windermere, and the pamphlet that went to England for Windermere was very deceptive, and they really had a hard time, the remittance people that went into Windermere, because of no transportation, of the cold weather and the poor ground.
They were lied to, and they
Yes.
were helpless, and they were here.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Elise Lundy talking about the origins of the Remittance Men. Dorothy Zollner's in the wings, and we're going to bring her out and talk about some of the communities that these dreamers created that just didn't last. We'll do that right after this break. Welcome back to Pioneers and Places. Elise Lundy's partner in their travels around the interior British Columbia telling the story of the Remittance Men is Dorothy Zollner. And I guess this was a challenge from the University Women's, you and Elise, to put together this story in the first place. And you've been having fun doing it ever since, Dorothy.
Well, you find out how much you don't know, Mike, but we've tried to find as much as we could absorb. We'll put it that way.
Good. Yeah, you're the editor of the Okanagan Historical Society report, too, so you have lots of interest in that way. These remittance men made their way across Canada and finally sort of arrived in British Columbia to ply their nefarious trade here. Wallachine was perhaps the biggest boondoggle of them all. Tell me about that.
Well, I don't know whether it was a boondoggle. I think history intervened with them. They came about 1910, perhaps, built up a community in Wallachine, just outside of Kamloops. And they had a lovely hotel there, everything done on the British scheme, because of course they were in British Columbia. And it was unfortunate, I think, for all of us, that World War I intervened, because they did grow apples. Unfortunately, they did get some bad advice. They had these thousands of acres, planted them out, were told to put crops in between the rows to hold them financially somewhat until the apples could produce. But they were told to put in tobacco, which leached the soil, crops that took away from the good of the soil. And therefore their apples, though producing, were not of the best quality.
And wasn't there a whole water issue too?
Oh, yes. They had to get water via flume from Bull Lake up above. They bought cheap lumber. It was not in regular lengths. Something would go wrong with the flume, and with the regular length flume, you could chop it out and correct it and mend it. They couldn't do that. They'd have to rip out the whole thing. It was poor lumber. It deteriorated. By and large, they just got pretty poor advice on what they should be doing.
So starting at about 1910 through to 1914, the
Yes.
beginning of the First World War, this was an attempt by young men who'd been told to leave England. We didn't want you embarrassing us there. Go to the colonies. They gravitated to Wallachine to
They did.
build something.
Yes.
Well, that was honorable, wasn't it? That was
It was indeed, and perhaps if the war hadn't come along, if they'd got better advice, perhaps it would have flourished. But they said, I believe, I hate quoting figures, but of 97 men left Wallachine of 102.
Now, how ill-prepared were some of these characters for what would seem to be an obvious job of work?
Well, take the flumes. They were told how to put them together, how to stabilize them, make them leak-proof. They did all that. And then they would call someone over and they'd say, but it's not working. And they were trying to make water run uphill. They just couldn't quite, they never had any background in agriculture per se.
But for heaven's sakes, you could see for heaven's sakes, these people were talented at what kinds of things?
They could play polo, they could play cricket. They were very musical. They dressed for dinner in the evening. They had a certain rapport about them, an aura perhaps of gentility.
There's a story of a man who was found near death. Tell me about his particular problem.
He had been lost 3 days in the bush. He was near running water. When they got to him, he was very badly dehydrated. So they said, well, you've got water all around you. How come after 3 days you haven't been drinking water just to keep alive? Oh, he said, I didn't have my drinking cup with me, don't you know?
These people must have been taken advantage of horribly by good Canadian settlers.
I don't think it was good Canadian settlers were particularly mean-spirited. The two groups just didn't understand one another. That's all. And yes, they became the butt of jokes. There were so many stories told about remittance men, and I think that's why you had people not saying that they were connected to remittance families, because they were the butt of jokes.
Okay, I'm going to take a break here, be back in just a second, because remittance men, I came from Vancouver Island, and the stories of remittance men are rife, but there were remittance men in the Okanagan and elsewhere, and we're going to talk about some of them and make apologies, perhaps, right after this break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts talking with Dorothy Zollner about the remittance men. And do we have any idea how many remittance men made their way finally? Has there been any census taken?
I've never found a census or a numbers given to the remittance men. I think because we were so scarcely populated in those days, they really stood out, however.
And is there often people of good British stock who came over and knew their stuff were accused of being remittance men? Is there a sensitivity about being referred to?
There's a definite sensitivity, and they will be very quick, some families, to say, but we were not remittance men.
Yeah. But some of the remittance men were great characters, and we love knowing them. We love having known them.
Oh, that's very true. The things they did, perhaps the accomplishment, really, they did accomplish things because they brought their background with them.
Now, even great families had you know, shoddy members. Lord and Lady Aberdeen were, of course, famous for developing the Okanagan Valley,
Yeah.
but Lady Aberdeen
Had a brother.
baggage, had a brother. Tell me about her brother.
Well, Coots Marchbank was her brother, and they had set him up on a ranch down in the States, and that didn't work out too well. So he came up here, and they bought Gershiken Ranch, and set him up with a friend, Eustace Smith, and the two of them were running this ranch. Now that wasn't working out too well, so they went up to Vernon and bought the Coldstream Ranch, Lord and Lady Aberdeen, and set Coots Marchbank up there. And I don't know whether he did better up there, perhaps, but as he grew older, perhaps like the rest of us, I think Ursula Surtees was quoted as saying they had sowed their wild oats and then they settled down and became quite respectable.
Well, this picture, which I'm looking at here, is this Eustace Smith and Coots Marchbank?
Yes, and I'm sorry, but the people used to call him Useless Smith.
Well, I mean, there you go.
Yeah.
This kind of photograph shows them playing the role. But he really was a horseman. He really tried to be a cowboy.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. They did try, but they had all these trappings that sort of belied the fact that they really knew what they were doing.
And they didn't.
They didn't.
The name Coots Marchbanks, too,
Yes.
and it's Marjorie Banks. If you were to see it written,
Yes.
it doesn't pronounce right. So that drew attention to him again.
Oh, yes.
He looked a role, his name was a role, and he stood out like a sore thumb.
Well, let's just say he had a very strong character.
What other characters are around? Because here's Paddy Ackland, for example, and he's famous for polo and for cricket, and yet he was considered to be a remittance man.
Yes, he says that himself. He said that he was going out to the colony, and he thought maybe his whole life would be one of riding, playing, and he's quoted as saying he really thought he would be chasing Indians.
Did he ever complain about it not being as a great adventure as he thought it was going
No,
to be?
I think he carved a really good life for himself right here.
And he was sort of a cultural icon.
Oh, very much so. Most of them were. They had musical backgrounds, they had sports backgrounds. Many of them knew Latin and Greek.
People say that we wouldn't have a Gilbert and Sullivan Opera Society in British Columbia if it weren't for remittance men.
Well, Summerland singers and players were very famous for their Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. And it turned out, I don't know whether he was a remittance man, but the gentleman who did the directing for them had been a member of the D'Oyly Cart in Britain. So you have all this expertise coming over to the colony.
The Church of England choir book basically was known by heart by remittance men. They'd been trained in the Church of England.
Of course they had, and that was another tenet to the bow, perhaps. They would go to Sunday service at the Church of England, and usually some of the local ladies would feel so sorry for them, they would always invite them back home to Sunday dinner.
When did that kind of thing occur? Because this is a great story. These guys often got paid quite a bit of money.
They did, but the way they lived, they would go through that in a hurry. It didn't last too long if you were out free spending or at the bar or whatever.
For example, you were telling me a story about a guy who was going to buy a ranch, and it came to a price, but it didn't stop there.
No, the local thought that he was selling the ranch. We'll give him $500
Lock, stock, and
lock,
barrel.
stock, and barrel, according to the guy who owned it. But the remittance man figured he would have to pay extra for the cattle, extra for the barn, extra for all the implements that were there. So when the local man heard this, he just cheerfully added things on.
So they were a bit spendthriftish.
Well, they'd never had to manage money. They had been given money all their lives. So they didn't really know when it might run out.
And so when it did, they'd adjourn the church service.
Well, you went to where you could get a free meal.
Was that pretty common? Or is that one of those modern legends that sort of cropped up, and they were accused of doing that, or did that happen really?
Well, that's maybe a legend from my own family, because this is Peachland again, but my grandmother used to say that these poor fellows would come to church, and so she felt so sorry for them. She was already cooking dinner for her own family, so of course they would be invited to join in.
Now, as we've discussed, this is a kind of a 34-year-long phenomenon.
Yes.
And it was put to an end by the First World War.
Yes.
Look at this picture of the Sycamoose. Look at all these guys aboard there. Who were they? Who were those guys?
Many of them went back. They were British. Many of them had been living on the west side of the lake as well. They went back to England to join their regiments at the outbreak of World War I. They felt obligated to go back, get back into service. As you know, it was a disaster, World War I. Many of them never came back. Peachland per capita lost the most men in World War I of any city or town in Canada.
Wow. What technique did they have? This may also be a legend, but it is a story that's told. What technique did they have for, say, dissolving their ranches before they jumped aboard the Sycamoose and headed home?
Mike, that's a fable we're not too sure about. It has been told to us that the men on the west side, starting up at Vernon, went from one ranch to another. One would burn his neighbor's house down, let his cattle go or his animals go free, and it went on down the line until they came, well, literally to where the ferry came across.
And that was their technique of saying, this life is gone, I'm heading home.
I'm heading home, the war, outbreak of war, I'm off to serve.
Where did you find your best stuff about Remittance Man, apart from your own memories, and some of those you're not telling about yet because the sensitivities are still pretty close to the surface?
Well, I have to credit Mark Zolke for his book. He's written very extensively about Remittance Men. Mrs. Weir has written about Wallachine, and we have a local book that describes some of our local remittance people. I must confess, for my part at least, the more I read about it, the less I think I know. But it's a fascinating subject, because through the years and as we get into it, more and more stories come to earth.
And I think to myself that every dollar they spent and made their mark as wastrels went into the pockets of Canadian businessmen and others who spread it around the community.
Well, as Charles Halliday wrote in his book, Valley of Youth, he said, yes, perhaps I did have a wasted youth. Perhaps I should have gone another route. But in all honesty, I can always say that if I had it to do over again, I would.
Dorothy Zollner, thank you very much. Thank you, Elise Lundy, for telling us the origins of the Remittance Men, and join us again next time for another Pioneers in Places. Bye-bye.